Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, there's a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him back.
Kyle Busch built a NASCAR career no other driver in history has matched, then lost his life within days of what looked like an ordinary sinus infection. His older brother, Kurt Busch, a fellow NASCAR Hall of Famer, has since stepped forward with raw, emotional accounts of what those final weeks actually looked like. So what did Kurt really reveal? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a two-time champion's story ended and why his own brother still struggles to accept it. The brother who watched it happen. Kurt Busch spent nearly 2 decades racing against his younger brother before either man could have imagined a conversation like the one Kurt would eventually have to give the public. The two Busch brothers grew up in Las Vegas, pushed into racing early by their father Tom, a mechanic who kept the family building and repairing cars long before either son ever sat behind a wheel professionally. Kurt turned pro first, and Kyle followed a few years later, and the sibling rivalry that formed between them became one of the defining storylines of NASCAR for most of the 2000s and 2010s. Two brothers chasing the same trophies while refusing to give an inch on the track. By January of 2026, that rivalry had softened into something closer to mutual pride. Kurt was formally welcomed into the sport's highest honor that month, and in a moment that now carries far more weight than anyone at the time could have guessed. Kyle stood on stage as his personal presenter, telling the crowd that watching Kurt believe in himself long before the results ever showed up had been an incredible experience to witness. Kurt later called it one of the proudest nights of his life, and together, the brothers hold the record for the most combined Cup Series victories by any sibling pair in NASCAR history, a fact that made the events of the following May almost impossible for anyone close to the family to process. Kurt had already stepped back from full-time competition by 2023, closing out a driving career that spanned more than 2 decades and shifting instead into a mentorship and ambassador role within the sport he had helped shape. That transition came after years of dealing with the lingering effects of a serious 2015 crash. And rather than walking away from racing entirely, Kurt found a new lane as a team owner and elder statesman, all while Kyle kept racing full-time for Richard Childress Racing, chasing wins and points the way he always had. Kurt's own resume speaks for itself. 34 Cup Series wins across 776 starts. A victory in the 2017 Daytona 500 that capped one of the most improbable redemption stories in NASCAR history, and a rare sweep of the NASCAR All-Star Race and the Coca-Cola 600 in the same season back in 2010, a feat few drivers have ever managed on the same night. Those accomplishments earned him a spot among NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers and a permanent place in the sport's Hall of Fame, cementing a legacy that Kyle had spent his own career trying to live up to and eventually surpass. That meant Kurt was watching his brother's final season unfold mostly from the outside, the same way millions of fans were, trading a helmet for a headset and a seat in the booth or the owner's box instead of the driver's seat. He still showed up at the track, still offered advice when Kyle needed it, still carried the weight of the Busch name into a new chapter. But for the most part, he was a spectator now, just like everyone else, right up until everything changed in a matter of days. Before we get into exactly what Kurt has said since then, you need to understand what actually happened to Kyle in the week leading up to May 21st, because the timeline itself is what makes this story so hard for anyone close to him to accept. The week that changed everything. Kyle Busch had been dealing with what looked like an ordinary sinus cold while competing at Watkins Glen on May 10, 2026, mild enough that he simply radioed his team asking for a doctor to give him a shot after the race before carrying on with his schedule. Nobody realized at the time that the infection was already beginning a slow, dangerous progression that would not fully reveal itself for another 11 days. Busch kept working straight through it. He won a Truck Series race at Dover, less than a week before his death, then finished 17th in the NASCAR All-Star race and even attended the opening of a go-kart track with his 11-year-old son Brexton in the days that followed. By every outward appearance, he was simply a busy driver managing a minor illness while preparing for the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, one of the sport's signature Memorial Day weekend events. Then, on Wednesday, May 20th, Busch was testing in a Chevrolet racing simulator in Concord, North Carolina, when he became unresponsive. An emergency call obtained by reporters described Busch experiencing shortness of breath, overheating, and coughing up blood the day before his death, with the caller found lying on a bathroom floor and telling dispatchers he was still awake. Emergency responders transported him to a hospital in Charlotte, and his family publicly confirmed only that he had been hospitalized with a severe illness and would not be competing in the upcoming race. Less than 24 hours later, on Thursday, May 21st, 2026, Kyle Busch died at the age of 41. 2 days after his passing, the Busch family released a statement explaining that a medical evaluation concluded severe pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, resulting in rapid and overwhelming complications. A death certificate, later obtained by reporters, filled in the rest of the picture, showing that Busch had been experiencing symptoms of bacterial pneumonia for days to weeks before sepsis finally set in. Sepsis itself is a life-threatening medical emergency in which the body's immune system, rather than simply fighting an infection, turns against its own tissue and organs. In Busch's case, that cascade led to disseminated intravascular coagulation, a rare blood clotting disorder, which then triggered hemorrhagic shock. Doctors who reviewed the case afterward noted that the physical strain of simulator testing, which mimics the intense forces drivers experience on track, may have placed additional stress on lungs that were already dangerously inflamed from the infection. Medical experts who spoke to reporters in the days that followed also pointed out how quickly the illness moved once it took a serious turn, with Busch's death certificate showing the sepsis stage alone lasted roughly a day before the resulting hemorrhagic shock and organ complications proved fatal, a pace that surprised even physicians accustomed to treating severe infections. For a family that had spent decades inside a sport built around visible physical danger, the idea that an ordinary sinus infection could take Kyle's life within 11 days was almost impossible to reconcile. And that disbelief is exactly what would come pouring out of Kurt Busch once he finally found the words to speak publicly. Now that you understand how quickly things unraveled, it is time to look at what Kurt actually said once he broke his silence, because his own account adds details no official statement ever could. What Kurt Busch actually revealed. Kurt Busch did not speak publicly right away. It took more than 2 weeks after Kyle's death for him to post his first statement, arriving on Instagram on June 8, 2026, alongside a collage of old family photographs. Kurt thanked fans for the outpouring of support and reflected on the days the two of them raced anything they could get their hands on, from big wheels as children all the way up to competing on NASCAR's biggest stages as adults, describing their relationship as one built on far more than fierce competition. In the post, Kurt wrote that no trophy or championship could ever measure the impact Kyle had on his life, adding that his heart was broken, but that he knew his brother's spirit would always ride with him. Kurt's grief resurfaced in a far more visible way roughly 3 months later, during a preview clip from a NASCAR-themed docuseries released in mid-August 2026. In the clip, Kurt grew visibly emotional, describing how fatherhood had reshaped Kyle's priorities in his final years, explaining that as Brexton grew older and began racing himself, Kyle wanted to stay active specifically so he could one day compete against his own son, the same way their father Tom had once pushed both Busch brothers into the sport. Kurt described watching Brexton stand beside his mother Samantha during the memorial ceremony held in Kyle's honor, and admitted through visible tears that the moment forced him to fully absorb that his brother was gone and was not coming back. Kyle's widow, Samantha, broke her own silence a few days before Kurt did, posting an Instagram statement on Friday, June 5th, 2026, that read in part, "The prayers, messages, flowers, meals, hugs, and countless acts of kindness have carried us through the most heartbreaking days of our lives." She described the family's hearts as absolutely shattered, while thanking fans and strangers alike for showing up for Brexton and Lennox in the weeks after their father's death, a message Kurt has since echoed almost every time he speaks about his brother's family in interviews. Kurt was far from the only person in Kyle's orbit processing similar disbelief that spring. NASCAR Hall of Famer Dale Earnhardt Jr., who had spent years as one of Kyle's fiercest on-track rivals before the two developed a genuine friendship built around short track and late-model racing, revealed on his own podcast that he had exchanged text messages with Kyle the day before he passed away. The two were finalizing plans for Kyle to drive one of Earnhardt's late-model cars in an upcoming Cars Tour race, with Kyle specifically requesting to run the number that had once belonged to Earnhardt himself. Their final exchange ended with Kyle sending a head-exploding emoji and the phrase "race fans," a lighthearted sign-off that Earnhardt admitted became almost unbearable to look back on once he learned what happened only a day later. Richard Childress, the team owner who guided Kyle through the final chapter of his Cup Series career, offered his own emotional reflection weeks later during a press conference originally scheduled to announce Kyle's contract extension for the 2027 season. Instead, Childress found himself eulogizing a driver he had once been warned would be too difficult to manage. Childress recalled speaking with Kyle by phone the night before he was hospitalized, with no indication that anything serious was unfolding, and compared the loss to that of Dale Earnhardt Sr., whose fatal crash at the 2001 Daytona 500 he had also lived through as a team owner. He said it was almost impossible to process losing two of the greatest drivers the sport has ever produced under his own roof. That same grief has since bled into an unexpected debate that Kurt himself helped stir. As a newly inducted Hall of Famer, Kurt now holds an actual vote in future induction decisions, and when asked whether NASCAR should fast-track Kyle into the Hall of Fame, given the circumstances, Kurt pushed back gently, telling reporters he believed the sport should stick with tradition rather than rush the process, even while acknowledging his brother belongs among the strongest candidates the Hall has ever considered. It was a striking moment of restraint from a man who had every emotional reason to want his brother honored immediately, and it revealed just how seriously Kurt takes the integrity of an institution he now helps oversee. With Kurt's own words now laid out clearly, it is worth stepping back to measure exactly what Kyle Busch's career actually meant to the sport, because the scale of what was lost is a major part of why his brother's grief has resonated so widely. The legacy Kurt is left carrying forward. Kyle Busch did not simply have a good career. By the time of his death, he stood as the winningest driver across NASCAR's 3 National Series combined, with 234 total victories spanning the Cup Series, the Xfinity Series, and the Truck Series, a number Richard Childress has openly said will likely never be equaled by another driver, pointing to Kyle's status as the all-time wins leader in both the Truck Series and the Xfinity Series. His 63 Cup Series wins rank 9th all-time, and that dominance across every tier of the sport is a level few drivers in history have ever come close to replicating. He claimed 2 Cup Series championships in 2015 and 2019, along with 2 regular season titles, and famously kept racing even in the days before his death, winning that Truck Series event at Dover just 6 days before he was hospitalized. His final Cup Series pole came at the Daytona 500 earlier that same year, a fitting bookend for a driver who spent his entire adult life chasing speed in every form the sport offered him. Earlier that same season, Kyle had already broken his own Truck Series win record, cementing a level of statistical dominance that Childress has repeatedly said future generations of drivers will spend decades trying to approach without ever quite catching up. Beyond the numbers, Kyle built his own Truck Series organization into a proving ground for the next generation of NASCAR talent, mentoring young drivers the same way older competitors had once guided him. NASCAR's chief executive captured that side of his legacy during the pre-race tribute held before the Coca-Cola 600, telling the crowd that what people would miss most about Kyle was not the wins themselves, but the quieter moments. The driver who wanted to help a teammate or offer advice without anyone watching. That tribute turned an ordinary Memorial Day weekend race into something closer to a public memorial, with roughly 95,000 fans in attendance at Charlotte Motor Speedway. NASCAR painted a black number 8 into the infield grass beside Kyle's old pit stall. Every car in the field carried a decal in his honor, and the cars formed a missing man formation during the pace laps, while the public address system and television broadcast fell silent on the 8th lap of the race. Kurt joined his parents, Kyle's widow Samantha, and Kyle's children Brexton and Lennox on the front stretch that evening, laying 8 white roses across the painted number as a bagpiper played Amazing Grace. Daniel Suarez, a driver Kyle had personally mentored earlier in his career, went on to win that same race and dedicated the victory to the Busch family through tears in Victory Lane. Richard Childress later confirmed that Kyle's stylized number 8, redesigned around his own input during his time with the team, will not be permanently retired, but instead set aside for Brexton whenever he is ready to race at NASCAR's highest level. A decision that gives Kurt's nephew a direct path to carrying his father's legacy forward on the track someday. For now, that legacy rests largely with Kurt, who has taken on the role of both grieving brother and public steward of a career that reshaped what winning across NASCAR's National Series actually looks like. Every statement Kurt has given since May, from the emotional Instagram post to the tearful docuseries interview to his careful comments on Hall of Fame timing, reflects a man trying to honor his brother's memory with the same steadiness Kyle himself was known for behind the wheel. Kurt has continued to represent Kyle publicly throughout the second half of 2026, showing up at NASCAR events, sitting for interviews he clearly finds difficult, and choosing his words with a caution that stands in sharp contrast to the emotion he shows every time the conversation turns personal. It is worth remembering, too, that grief like this rarely arrives on a single day and then disappears. Kurt has described the process as one that keeps catching him off guard, whether through an old photograph, a race broadcast, or simply watching his nephew Brexton climb into a race car, the way Kyle once did as a boy in Las Vegas. That ongoing, visible grief is part of why his public comments have resonated so widely across the racing community and beyond it, because they capture something honest about loss that a press release never could. The timing of it all adds another layer that Kurt has had to sit with. Just months before Kyle's death, the two brothers had shared one of the happiest nights of their professional lives together on that Hall of Fame stage. Kurt receiving his ring directly from the hands of the sibling he had once battled bumper to bumper for 2 decades. Photographers captured them smiling side by side on the red carpet that January evening, an image that circulated widely again in May for a very different reason once news of Kyle's death broke. That contrast, a joyous induction followed only months later by a sudden funeral, is part of what has made the entire year so difficult for the extended Busch family to process. And it is a big reason Kurt has chosen his public words so carefully every time he steps in front of a camera or microphone since. Kyle Busch's story did not end the way anyone in NASCAR expected. And Kurt Busch has spent the months since making sure the world understands exactly who his brother was, both on the track and away from it, rather than letting the shock of those final 11 days define how he is remembered. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.